I still remember walking into medical school on day one, feeling overwhelmed, a little intimidated, and honestly, not sure if I belonged there. But 4 years later, I'm graduating, and today I want to take you through that entire journey. Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. If you're new here, my name's Josh. I'm a Marine Corps veteran and incoming emergency medicine resident doctor, and on this channel, I talk about health and medical topics, along with insights in my journey through medicine. In diving into my time in medical school, I think we first need to briefly touch on my pre-med journey because it represented a significant time in my life actually leading up to getting accepted and getting started in med school. For me, this started back in 2015 when I got out of the Marine Corps, and I actually didn't know what to do with my life at that point, so I fell into a business degree and I completed that in about 3 years. I graduated, I worked for a little while, but there was nothing that I ever fell in love with in business, so after having a heart-to-heart with myself, I ended up going back to school for pre-med and I started working in the hospital. And that's kind of when things clicked. I knew that I was in the right field and that this is something that I could be passionate about. But the pre-med journey by itself is a challenging road. Those classes for me, and I think in general, it's probably safe to say, are more challenging than the business classes, although I think they are more interesting. Because there wasn't a lot of transfer from business school to pre-med, I basically had to start from scratch. And then all of the while I'm working in the hospital, studying for the MCAT, which is a beast of a test to get into medical school. And then there's the whole application process. So you're applying to a bunch of different schools, you're putting together your application, so your personal statement, your activities, trying to maintain a good GPA, taking the MCAT again, and then actually doing the interviews and hopefully getting accepted. So getting that acceptance letter was just an incredible feeling and represented a huge milestone in my life. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. And I'm not sure if I can really convey it appropriately, but the process to get into medical school, to boil it down, is just a very challenging and very competitive process. There are far more applicants than there are available seats, and many people end up having to apply a couple years in a row to actually get in. So getting that acceptance letter and starting was just huge. But moving forward and actually walking through the doors on day one and getting started, it was a feeling that's hard to describe. An incredible feeling of pride because you know that you've worked your tail off to get here and this is something that you've earned, but you also know the mountain that lies before you. So these were feelings of anxiousness, nervousness, fear, uncertainty, doubt, a little bit of imposter syndrome because you're not sure if you belong there or if you deserve to be there, especially when you look around at the caliber of person that will be your classmate, because these are really smart people and honestly the creme de la creme. So even though all of the evidence points to the fact that you deserve to be there because you went through the ringer and you got accepted, you still kind of question if you're good enough or not. But I will say I had to very quickly put those feelings aside because once you actually get started, you really have to hit the ground running. So I can talk about that experience in getting started with first year, but before I do that, just to provide a brief overview of the structure of medical school. So it's 4 years. The first 2 years are primarily in the classroom, and then years 3 and 4 are your clinical rotations. And if I could boil down first year into one sentence, it's really learning how to learn or how to study as a medical student, because how you study as a pre-med simply isn't going to work in medical school. There's just way too much content. It's probably roughly 4x the quantity of material. It's not necessarily harder than the stuff that you're expected to learn in pre-med, but there is a lot more of it. The common comparison that you may hear is that learning in medical school is like drinking water from a fire hose. And having gone through the process, I can wholeheartedly agree with that. So again, those feelings that I had initially in walking through the doors were very quickly replaced by a sense of urgency in trying to figure out how to do this. And I'd say that figuring out how to learn effectively and in a time efficient manner, some people can do it rather quickly, maybe in the first couple months, but I'd say for most of us, and this was the case for me, it took me the better part of first year to actually lock it in. A typical schedule for me would have been going to class for maybe 4 or 5 hours in the first part of the day. So in the classroom from 8 a.m. to noon or 1, and then coming home and studying for the rest of the day, often until 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. And my primary method of studying was doing Anki flashcards, which are smart flashcards if you're not familiar with it. And I'd say I was easily hitting 1,000 or even sometimes more flashcards every single day, especially in the early phases when I was trying to figure out how to actually study. And throughout first year, you have exams at the end of each block, so there's definitely some degree of anxiety about passing those. For me, at my school, they were all pass-fail, so that did alleviate some of the pressure, but they are still extremely challenging exams, and you do need to pass them, because if you don't pass them the first time, there's always issues with finding time later to try to retake them while trying to maintain that information from the previous block, but also learning the information from the new block that you started. And then there could also be repercussions with not passing a block the first time, because that's going to show up on your transcript and something that may come across in your application to residency eventually. So it's really important to pass the tests the first time around. And actually, speaking to the pass-fail level, so the minimum pass rate was 70% on those exams, and that sounds very low, I understand, but just to provide some perspective on this, the same people that are passing with a 70 or 71% on those exams are the same students in undergrad who are absolutely smoking their classes. Straight A students, 4.0s. I don't know if I can fully convey how challenging this is, but thankfully for me at least, I was able to pass all of my exams the first time around, so it wasn't an issue. Speaking a little bit more to the structure of classes that I had, my school was a little different. Some schools will have that typical PowerPoint classroom vibe. Ours had what they called a flipped classroom, where essentially they kind of sell it like you're studying on your own before going to class, and we did, but rather than going into the classroom and having a PowerPoint presentation, we were actually going over patient cases, sometimes real, maybe sometimes made up, but going over real world applications with patient cases where we're learning and applying the information that we had studied going in, which I think made it much more engaging and a lot more bearable for me, especially coming from several years of PowerPoint classroom styles before. Honestly, I was at this point somewhat over the classroom. And then we did start learning the physical exams, which are going to come in handy once you get into the hospital. You know, there's different physical exams. There's the neurologic, cardiac, abdominal, musculoskeletal, for example. So these things are very important to learn throughout the process so that you're not just getting to the end of second year and learning all of it at the same time. Plus, this gives you more of a chance to get repetitions in to become more proficient with it. One other thing, we also did get a little bit of exposure clinically by doing shadowing shifts, but I would say those were relatively few and far between, and the bulk of the clinical experience comes in third and fourth year. So closing out first year, this is really when I locked in my studying skills and my routine. So at this point, I would say I was a professional medical student in that I actually knew how to study as a med student. And that made going into second year way easier, because now you know how to study and manage your time effectively without being overwhelmed. But second year more or less is the same as first year. You're in the classroom, you're learning more systems, you're learning more physical exams and getting practice with that. One big thing that I forgot to mention is that through all of first and second year, and actually third and fourth year as well, they have what you call OSCEs, which are essentially patient simulations. So there's a simulated lab or clinic setting where you're going in as the physician or medical student, and you're doing patient encounters with what they call standardized patients who are essentially actors and actresses. That's a cool thing that people may or may not know about. So they actually pay actors and actresses to come in and act as patients, and these people are really talented. You know, they take us through different scenarios, a couple of which are managing difficult emotions. So for example, if a patient has a terminal illness and it's managing difficulty emotions, they may be crying and you have to console them and display empathy. If there was a mistake that's made with another patient, or depending on what's going on, they may be very angry, and these actors and actresses are just straight yelling into your face. You have to maintain your calm and composure and kind of talk them off the ledge. So they throw a variety of situations your way, and these situations really test a variety of your abilities, but also kind of teach you along the way in how to appropriately deal with these things. But closing out second year, this is really the culmination of all of the classroom work that you've done for the prior 2 years, and it's really an exciting time, especially for those of us who are absolutely sick of the classroom and just want to get into the hospital and start working with patients, because honestly, that's why we're here in the first place. We want to work with patients. But before we can actually get into the hospital and start working with patients and starting our clinical rotations, there's one more trial by fire that we have to go through, which is taking the USMLE Step 1 exam. So this is a 3-part exam. We take Step 1 at the end of second year, Step 2 at the end of third year, and then most people take Step 3 during residency. And all All of these are absolute beasts of a test, but I'll keep it to step 1 for now. So step 1 is about a 7-hour exam. It used to be scored, but they moved it to pass fail. And you would think that that would relieve some of the pressure with it, and maybe it did a little bit, but there's still a lot of pressure in being able to pass this test the first time around, because if you don't, that could be potentially detrimental to your residency application and actually matching into a residency. And even though you have a month off, this is far from a vacation. I was still waking up early every single day and studying into the late hours of the evening time just to prepare for this adequately. And I actually extended my study time into a second month, so I ended up taking 8 weeks for it, because at the end of the first month, I wasn't scoring within an adequate range that left me confident in actually going ahead and taking the test. And I really wanted to make sure that I could pass it the first time around. This was a big decision because there are pros and cons with each. You want to make sure that you're going to pass it the first time, so if you take it before you're ready and you fail, that could be a very bad thing. But on the other end, if you extend your time, that could potentially push the start date of your clinical rotations later and possibly delay your graduation. Luckily though, at the end of the 8 weeks, I took the exam, I passed it the first time, and I was able to still start my clinical rotations on time, which then allowed me to graduate on time as well. But walking out of the step 1 exam, I felt absolutely terrible. And I think this is the case for most med students. I honestly felt like I failed it. I was worried about retaking it. I didn't know if I was still going to be able to be a medical student, and I started considering other career options at this point. And it's a painfully long process waiting to get that score. For most people, it takes about 3 weeks or more to get that score back. So that was a really painful waiting period, and honestly, the longest 3 weeks of my life up to that point. I had no idea what was going to happen. But thankfully, I passed it on the first time, which was an incredible feeling. I knew that I was still going to be able to be a med student and hopefully a doctor one day, and that I at least got to then proceed with starting my clinical rotations in 3rd year. So starting out clinical rotations in 3rd year was a huge relief, not only because I passed step 1 and kind of overcame that hurdle, but also getting out of the classroom, which was just a miserable thing, honestly, and actually getting into the hospital to care for patients, which is why I wanted to do this in the first place. To provide a brief overview of the structure of these rotations, typically they're between 4 to 8 weeks long, and we all have to go through the same rotations. So IM, FM, neurology, psych, OB-GYN, surgery, and pediatrics. And then for me, emergency medicine, which we do 4th year at Rush. And the way they set up the structure for these rotations is really interesting because it feels like a bit of a roller coaster, because at the start of each rotation, it's a new rotation, you're a total newbie, and you don't know what you're doing. And by the time you get to the end of the 4, 6, or 8 weeks long, depending on the rotation, that's when you feel like you're finally starting to get the hang of it in that specific specialty. And then as soon as that happens, boom, you're on to the next rotation and you're a total noob again. So if I could sum up 3rd year in one sentence, it would be that you're constantly hitting the reset button and constantly feeling incompetent. But maybe one thing that you don't necessarily realize or fully appreciate in the moment, and you don't realize it until later, is just how much you're actually learning in that period of time. And I think a good tangent from that point is actually when you're able to zoom out and kind of see your progress, comparing yourself as a 3rd year medical student to how you were in 2nd and 1st year, even though that's not necessarily in the big picture a long period of time, you're learning so much through each stage that the 3rd year version of you can't compare to the 2nd year and 1st year version of yourself. That version of you just 1 year later can run circles academically and clinically around the previous version. For example, me as a 2nd year med student, academically, I could run circles around the 1st year med student version of myself. And that also translates clinically because as a 4th year med student, I was much more proficient, knowledgeable, and skillful than the 3rd year version of myself. So even though there's a relatively short period of time from 1 year to the next, the knowledge and skill gap between those time periods is substantial. And that's something that I didn't necessarily realize or fully appreciate until later on. But closing out 3rd year and getting done with those clinical rotations, we have the next trial by fire, which is the USMLE Step 2. So again, this is another beast of a test. It's also about 7 or 8 hours. I did only take 4 weeks to study for this one. And the difference between this and Step 1 is that Step 2 is actually scored. So where Step 1 used to be a little more heavily weighted into your residency application, that now got passed on to Step 2 because it's the only scored exam that we take, and a good way for residency programs to kind of compare the academic ability of the medical students. This was another grueling experience experience of just studying for a month straight from the early morning to late evenings with a little bit of anxiety about trying to pass this test the first time, but also now trying to get a good enough score to get into the specialty that I wanted to. But I will say I went into step 2 with much more confidence than I had going into step 1, and thankfully everything went well. I passed the first time around, and I knew that I got a score that would facilitate my success on the residency application and getting into the specialty that I was planning on applying to. Getting the score back for step 2 also took about a 2 or 3 week period, although I was less anxious during that time because again, I did have more confidence, but getting the score back, seeing that I passed it and I got an adequate score was a fantastic feeling. And it was really just another boost in confidence in heading into clinical rotations in 4th year. So heading into 4th year was great. And I will say that I think that every year in medical school gets better than the year before. And one thing that made 4th year so fantastic, in my opinion, was that I got to pretty much make the schedule that I wanted down to the T. There were a couple things that I had to do as far as requirements. For me, that included emergency medicine because that's one of the core clinical rotations that we do 4th year at Rush instead of 3rd year like some other schools. I had to do a sub-internship, which I chose to do in internal medicine. And then basically the rest of the year is all electives. And I basically got every elective that I wanted to, and I was able to time them perfectly to my preference. And at this point, I had decided to apply to emergency medicine residency. So one other thing that I had to do was I had to do an away rotation for emergency medicine at an outside hospital, which I ended up doing in Michigan at the program that I ended up matching into. And one of the other things that I did in 4th year, which made it even better for me, was that I heavily weighted all of the challenging and most demanding rotations in the fall period leading up to Christmas, so that when I hit Christmas break, I was basically done. I just had a few other rotations in the spring semester that were much easier, less demanding, and far better as far as the schedule. But speaking more to 4th year and how that experience actually felt, I would say that this was the first time in my med school career where I actually started feeling like a doctor and I stopped feeling like a med student. And this was really evident in the early phases of my 4th year when I was doing those challenging rotations. I ended up doing 3 emergency medicine rotations, and I think with that came repetition and confidence and really building competency. And that's when I kind of hit the groove where I started feeling like I knew what I was doing. And this may not be the case for everybody. It's probably what you make of it. But for me, I set a goal out in 4th year to get to the level as close as possible to an intern or first year resident. And while that's not entirely possible, because as a med student, there's things that you just can't do that residents are able to do, like write prescriptions and a ton of other things that they do in the background that med students just can't possibly do because of regulations or other reasons. But I do think that I was able to achieve that goal in many aspects, or at least as close as possible. And this is evidenced by some of my evaluations with comments from a few of the attending physicians that I had worked with that said something along the lines of, "This medical student is already operating at the level of an intern or first year resident physician," which was a fantastic feeling and gave me that much more confidence in completing 4th year and heading into residency. So in talking about concluding 4th year and heading into residency, there's one more trial by fire that we have to go through as medical students, and that is the match process, which is essentially the process that you have to undergo to apply and match into your residency program. This differs from the med school application process, in where you can get accepted to multiple med schools and essentially decide where you want to go. In the match process, you do apply to multiple programs, but you can only match with one. But similarly, this is also a long and drawn out process of putting your application together, including your personal statement, activities, and letters of recommendation. And then since I was applying to emergency medicine, one of the requirements for us is that we have to do an away rotation, which I mentioned before, because emergency medicine residency programs require 2 standard letters of evaluation, one from the ER rotation at your home program, and then one from an away program as well. Speaking to my specific application, my school would probably yell at me if they knew how many programs I actually applied to. So generally speaking, it's probably good to apply to about 30 programs, interview with at least 12, and then rank as many programs as you interviewed with. But for me, I only ended up applying to about 17 programs, and then I believe I got about 14 or 15 interview invitations. However, I only accepted about 7 of them because at this point, I was very confident in my application and I was somewhat over the process of just going through interviews for the sake of interviewing. Honestly, for me, doing those additional interviews felt like it would have been a waste of time because I was so confident in my application, and honestly, those other programs were ones that I wasn't necessarily passionate about going to anyway. But for anybody going through the process, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it the way that I did. You're probably better served in applying and interviewing with more programs. But speaking a little bit more to that confidence that I had going into the match, I actually ended up doing 3 separate rotations at the program that I planned on ranking number 1. So I did emergency medicine ultrasound, and anesthesia there. I basically didn't leave them alone because I knew that's where I wanted to go. I got very good feedback from them from each rotation, and they were very transparent in where I stood in the application process. And so the experiences from that rotation, along with the feedback that they gave me, left me very confident that that's where I was gonna match. And so that confidence, along with some degree of certainty, took almost all of the anxiety out of the match process for me. This is actually kind of funny. We had a class at Rush at some point during this process before the match, and in one of the classes, we were sitting in a circle with me and my classmates, and we were going around basically sharing how we were feeling about the upcoming match day. And the general vibe in the classroom was that everyone was extremely nervous and anxious in just hoping that they were going to match at all, but also worried about where they were going to match. And when they got around to me after everyone spoke their piece, I just basically said, I'm excited. I feel very good about this. I have a reasonable expectation of where I'm going to match, and I honestly just can't wait to get there. I'll say that's definitely not the norm, and maybe I should have had a little bit more anxiety than I did, but having that confidence and lack of anxiety made this entire process so much more enjoyable. So really for me, after completing interviews, it was just a waiting game, waiting for match day. So leading into match day, which was March 20th, that prior Monday, which was March 16th, we actually got an email. And in that email, it basically tells you whether or not you matched at all, but you don't get to see which program you matched into. So on that Monday, I got the email. I found out that I did match, but I didn't know where. And then at that point, you have to wait until Friday, March 20th for the match day ceremony to open your envelope to see what program you actually matched into. So on Friday, we had the match ceremony. We get all the med students together with family and friends. They hand you an envelope, and in that envelope, that's your future. You know that you matched at this point, you just don't know where, and you're counting down the seconds to where they finally let you open the envelopes because you all open them together. And in the moment where they say, open the envelopes, everyone opens at the same time, and you just hear a sea of shouts and celebration. And I look at my envelope and I find that I matched with my number 1 rank, my first choice emergency medicine program in St. Joe, Michigan. This was an absolutely incredible feeling and a moment that I'll never forget, because it represented the culmination of all of the hard work up until this point, and the moment where it really hit me that I'm going to be an emergency medicine doctor. Moving on to a few days after match day, when that high kind of starts to come down a little bit, now you start focusing on the next steps, which is you technically still have to finish 4th year. And for many students, they still have clinical rotations. But for me, I was able to knock all of them out prior to match day so that I had no other rotations. And I was basically just off in between match and graduation, which was a wonderful thing, because after all of this hard work, it was really nice to have some time off and to start planning on relocating to Michigan for residency. So in this time, the residency program was reaching out to me. There's a handful of administrative tasks that I needed to get done. One of the big things is trying to figure out where to live. So I was kind of driving back and forth in between Illinois and Michigan, trying to find a house or apartment to move into. And I'm happy to say that I was able to find a house for rent that is right across the street from the hospital, which is going to be incredibly important, I think, in residency, considering the gnarly hours that we're going to be working. So I can just walk right across the street to work. That means extra sleep and time off that I can spend with friends and family. So other than planning relocation and taking care of those admin tasks and getting started for residency, I was done with med school. No clinical rotations, and otherwise it was just my own time. And I think that's a double-edged sword, because it's nice to have the time off, especially after you've been working so hard for so long. It's just a wonderful thing. But on the other side, with having all of that time off, by the time I start residency in July, it will have been several months since I last saw a patient. So I will probably be going in with maximum rust, and that's definitely a concern. But in talking to residents and attendings, It seems like that rust gets knocked off pretty easily and you actually remember more than you thought you would. So essentially their advice was just to enjoy the time off while you have it, and come July, just hit the ground running, which I certainly plan on doing. Of course, I was more than happy to take that advice, and actually I have a trip planned to go to Ireland with some very close family friends that I'm very much looking forward to. But moving on from the end of 4th year into graduation. So graduation for us took place on May 2nd, and it's difficult to describe this experience because how do you summarize the culmination of all of your hard work and dedication over the course of a decade of your life? But getting handed that diploma and reflecting back on the journey, that 10 years of dedication, hard work, uncertainty, doubt, fear, blood, sweat, and tears that brought me to this moment, and knowing that I had done it and that I'm now a medical doctor, was an incredibly humbling and proud moment, and one that I can't fully convey in words. This was an over 10-year journey since I left the Marine Corps, and finally reaching the end of the road, or at least the beginning of the next one, is an absolutely amazing feeling. And I'm so excited to start residency. I know that it's going to be an incredible challenge and there are going to be bumps in the road along the way, but I can't wait to start that next chapter. So that was my med school journey from day one all the way to graduation. But one of the biggest challenges in this time was trying to figure out what kind of doctor I actually wanted to be. So if you want to see more about how I actually navigated all of my clinical rotations and ultimately chose emergency medicine, be sure to check out this video over here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.